Welcome to this video on continuous monitoring. On the CISSP exam, you are certainly going to see question about continuous monitoring. It's very important topic when it comes to monitoring activities and also security operations. Now, continuous monitoring is also sometimes called continuous improvement. The idea is that we are maintaining ongoing awareness of organizational risk and the security posture of the system within the organization. Now, a lot of time people get this confused with the system monitoring, like using a SIM system, a security information and event management, or looking through your logs or whatever. In reality, it is not. Continuous monitoring is completely different. It is not a constantly watching all of your log files or constantly monitoring the system. In reality, what we are doing is we are monitoring the security control implementations. That's what we are looking at. So log data might be part of the overall strategy, but it is not the only part when it comes to continuous monitoring. We are looking at all of the controls, whether it administrative, logical, technical and physical. So we are looking at everything as a whole from an ongoing awareness standpoint of the risk and the security posture. So that's what continuous monitoring is focused on. What we are doing is regularly evaluating security controls, and we are looking for the effectiveness against current threats and vulnerabilities. Remember that when we come up with some kind of remediation or some kind of implementation for security controls, at that point in time it might be effective, but as new threats become realized, as new vulnerabilities present themselves, those security controls may not be effective anymore. So that's where continuous monitoring comes in. We are regularly evaluating these things to make sure they are going to meet the current standard for threat and vulnerability protection. This is also referred to as due diligence. Due care is that we come up with an implementation for security controls. Due diligence is that we are improving upon that based on the current threats and vulnerabilities. So this helps us maintain full situational awareness by looking at all of the controls, not just technical, not just physical, or not just ministry, or everything collectively from a security posture perspective. And when it comes to continuous monitoring, when you are performing a security assessment, a security test, a risk assessment, risk analysis, an audit, anything, this is probably the most important data you are going to collect as part of this process. Whenever you are doing your data collection process for your test or your assessment, you want to continuous monitoring data because you want to know what was in place before and when the last time you took a look at it. So when you run that test and assessment and it comes back as a failure or comes back as something that's a high risk or critical risk, you know why? Because you have not been continuously monitoring that, you have not been regularly evaluating the controls effectiveness against the security baseline. So this is very important to know. Now when it comes to continuous monitoring, this subject can get rather large. There are two main places to look for continuous monitoring. One is going to be the NIST Special Publication 800-137. This is Information Security Continuous Monitoring, or ISCM. And then there's the ISO 27004, which is monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. Now both of these are going to refer to continuous monitoring or continuous improvement. What you are most likely to see on the exam is NIST SP 800-137. So that's what we are going to walk through for the remaining of this video. Now your monitoring strategy is going to start with the scope. What is in the scope? What assets or personals are going to be evaluated? What controls are going to be involved? Is it going to affect primary operation or production operation? Is it going to affect the recovery side? Is it going to affect the third party application or third party services? Also, what are we looking for? Are we looking for access control? Are we looking for password management? Are we looking at patching? What is the overall risk? What we are thinking into account here? What about authentication? All these things. As you can see, these start to get really big in terms of the scope. So we want to narrow those things down, and perhaps we do continuous monitoring a little bit different for administrative controls. Maybe we are looking at policies once a year, where we are looking at technical controls that we really care about. Maybe we are looking at those every 3 months, and that's why the scope is so important. Then we want to look at the method. How are we going to evaluate this? Is it going to be a manual? Can we automate this? Are we performing an inspection? Are we going to interview somebody? Is it a vulnerability scan? Is it a host discovery scan? Whatever this could be, we want to define and understand what that method's going to be, because an automated scan is probably not going to be as effective as manual inspection, because when you are manually inspecting, you are going to see things that the scanner probably not configured to find. That's why when we do vulnerability scan, we don't just do scan, we do vulnerability scan, but then we need to go and look at some other areas, because the scanner is not going to help you to determine how a TLS certificate installed. It might tell you that it's there, but it's not going to tell you it's self-signed. It is not going to tell you that it's expired. So there's a lot of different things that come into play here. So we want to take that in consideration. And then I touched on this in terms of scope, policies, and whatnot. How often are we going to look at things? Are we going to look at controls on a monthly basis, a weekly basis? Maybe it's daily, depending on what you are doing, right? And then lastly, the metric. How are we measuring and tracking this? How are we tracking success? How are we tracking failure? What compliant, what's not compliant? That's what we are talking about with the monitoring strategy. And then we are going to document all this. We are going to create what calls a continuous monitoring plan or a continuous monitoring strategy, whatever you want to call it. But we will create an artifact that defines all this. Then we have to look at things from a specific tier level, because all of the controls are going to fall into one of these 3 tiers, where you have tier 1, which is basically your overall risk management strategies. We have to define those. We have to know what those are before we start diving into the continuous monitoring, because that's what going to help us focus on the various control of importance. So we are going to define that criteria, that scope, and then we are going to determine what we are going to assess as part of the continuous monitoring. This is where we define that overall strategy. Then we have tier 2, which are all the business processes or the critical business functions. This is going to define how that core mission is done, or that core business process is done within the organization. And we are going to collect, correlate, analyze, and report those things. Then we moved into tier 3, where we are defining those security and privacy controls that are going to meet the business objectives. And that exactly why, if you see on the left and the right on the triangle, you see these narrows, because each one of this tier is going to influence the other from a continuous monitoring perspective. Now, these tiers you do not need to know for the exam. I am just kind of demonstrating how the continuous monitoring process flows. You need your strategy first. Then you have to determine what those processes are. Then you can evaluate those controls that impact the process, that will affect the overall strategy. Because if we are not catching this control and monitoring them, we need to change our strategies, don't we? That's the idea here. So the continuous monitoring process is pretty straightforward. First, we are going to define the strategy. This is going to be based on the risk tolerance level, whether it's high, moderate, low, whatever it is. Then we are going to establish whatever the metrics are, what is success, what is failure, how are we going to do this, manually, automated, anything, the frequency and the scope as well. Then the next step is to implement the method we are going to use to collect that monitor data, whether we are using it all from a centralized log server, whether we are going to send it to another log server, whatever it is, how are we going to collect this data. And don't forget about policies, procedure, process, and so on from the administrative side. How are we going to get those processes so we can look at them? Then we are going to analyze everything. We are going to analyze all the collected data, and then we are going to report the findings to the senior management as a part of the continuous monitoring. And once the decisions are made on what to do, we will respond to the known risk using security or privacy controls. And then we are going to review and update the monitoring program by adjusting the strategies to meet the organizational needs. So that's where the triangle comes in. We have the strategies, process, and then the controls, and those are all working together to effectively build continuous monitoring into the organization. So the bottom line is here is to understand the purpose of continuous monitoring and know the step of the NIST SP 800-137 processes.